like to go back to the ancient Greeks because they started science early on, not as we know it today. That goes back about 400 years, but certain scientific principles began. They used deductive reasoning. That's using reasoning power starting from general statements to specific conclusions. And they also use inductive reasoning, going from specific examples to general statements. It usually involved astronomy, which is my chosen field, dealing with the motions of the planets, the stars, the sun, the moon, the phase of the moon, and so forth. And I'll give you a couple examples of inductive reasoning from the past dealing with astronomy. First of all, the shape and size of the Earth. It's a very common belief, misconception, that everybody thought the world was flat until 500 years ago at the time of Columbus. Well, it turns out people at least 2,500 years ago knew the world was spherical. Think about that. 2,500 years ago, people knew the world was spherical. And they had different arguments for that. One of them is the fact that when you see a lunar eclipse, the shape of the shadow is always a circle, and only a sphere will cast a circle all the time, regardless of the orientation. There had other arguments too, but that's one of the better ones they had. Then the geocentric theory. This is the dominant theory, the most successful theory of all time. A guy named Ptolemy, back around the 100 AD, put together this elaborate theory with epicycles going around and around to explain the motions of the sun, the moon, and the planets. And that theory persisted for 15 centuries. It was overthrown 400 years ago with the rise of modern science.
The Earth is the center. And
yeah,
everything
Earth is the center, and you're trying to explain the motions of the planets using circles. And it was a very complex theory which caused its collapse eventually. So a lot of interesting things from the history of science itself. Now, one of the most important people I like to talk about is Sir Francis Bacon. He lived 400 years ago. He was English. And he wrote a book published in 1620, Novum Organum. That's the Latin title, because all this sort of thing was written in Latin back then. It means new instrument. And in that book, and in a book a few years later he published called Leviathan, he put forth the scientific method, the thing you learn in school about hypothesis, and you test and you refine, and so all the steps, all Baconian science that he did. And he's also then the father of the inductive reasoning as well. He started up that idea 4 centuries ago. Everybody knows this except for one thing. What they don't know is that he wrote extensively on theology. You know, he took the Bible very seriously, as did most educated people in Europe at the time. And this is the untold side of Francis Bacon. He invented science, the scientific method, but yet he took the Bible very, very seriously.
Is there a connection?
Absolutely. We'll get to that in just a moment. The view of God made science possible. Yes. Sir Isaac Newton comes along a bit after Bacon. He wrote his Principia. Actually wrote it 20 years earlier, but in 1687 he published it. And in that he laid out calculus, physics, all these sorts of things. He did all the work before he was 22 years old, by the way. In 1704 he publishes optics. So this man invented calculus and he invented physics as we know it. But the thing we don't really understand is the fact that he wrote more than 4 million words on theology. He wrote 10 times as much on theology than he did on math and science combined. So the man was very biblically literate and took the Bible extremely seriously. You know, you don't hear that story today about too many scientists today. Okay. And then you find other people, I'll just mention in passing, Copernicus with the heliocentric theory, popularization of that, Galileo with his use of the telescope for astronomy.
Just tell our people what heliocentric means.
That means the sun is the center and the planets, including the Earth, go around the sun. Right. Good point. Tycho Brahe, a Danish astronomer who did keen observations that his employee and student Johann Kepler used later to devise his 3 laws of planetary motion. All these people contemporaries roughly with one another 400 or 500 years ago. All these men steeply influenced by Christianity. Copernicus himself was a priest. Galileo wasn't, but he worked within the confines of the church. Yes. And Kepler and Tycho they were Protestant, and they had very definite, strong views about Christianity and the Bible. Took the Bible very seriously. Again, the story you don't hear in school very much. Go back to Newton. I got a couple of quotes here, 3 quotes from his Principia. This most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. Obviously, Newton believed in intelligent design, didn't he? And then this being governs all things, not as the soul of the world, but as Lord overall. And finally, this last quote I want to give you from Mr. Principia, and thus much concerning God, to discourse of whom from the appearances of things does certainly belong to natural philosophy. That's what we called science. We would call science today, they called natural philosophy. These aren't the kind of words you'd find in too many science textbooks today, but this is the founding document of physics and modern astronomy.
Yes.
So obviously Christianity played a very key role in all this. Well, we have Martin Luther a bit before them, establishing the Protestant Reformation, and he taught that all honest work was worthy of honor. You see, before that, the Roman Catholic Church had separated the sacred from the secular. The king and the priests were doing the Lord's work. Everybody else, you were just doing venal, secular sort of work. And the Protestant Reformation said, no, all work, if it's honest, is worthy of honor. So they took the separation between the sacred and the secular apart, and they began to think that they were thinking God's thoughts after him. They were trying to think about how God was making the world work. And they also, I understand Newton, on some of his writings at the end, would publish in Latin beneath that, all to the glory of God. Again, you don't find that kind of sentiment too much in science today. But this is what the founders of science thought. Very different from today. And I think that Christianity, particularly Protestant Christianity, then made science possible. Because you see, our Creator is a God of order. He's not a God of chaos. And He's also a God who is knowable. We can know Him. It's possible to know Him and Him to know us. We can have a relationship with Him. And so the working hypothesis was perhaps this Creator who is knowable and a God of order. Perhaps He imprinted some of those characteristics of knowability and order upon His universe. And we're told in the New Testament, for instance, that this current world is sustained by the power of His Word. Well, just what does that mean? Is this, can we reason through and can we discover some of the order that might be there? And so the conclusion, or the working hypothesis that people had 4 centuries ago in Protestant Europe, was that the world is ordered and it's knowable. And that was a revolutionary idea. Nobody really in the past had thought about that. In the ancient Western deities, the Romans and Greeks, with their polytheism, their gods were just supermen. They weren't transcendent, so they didn't really control the way the world worked. And in the Far East, you had the yin and the yang. Things were changing at chance all the time. If you did an experiment today, you wouldn't expect the same result tomorrow or in another place. It's going to change continually all of the time. So in those kind of world systems, you would not expect the world to be knowable. You wouldn't expect it to be ordered, and hence you wouldn't expect it to be predictable. So the 17th century is a neat time because science as we know it began at that time in Northern Europe. And the Bible was taken seriously and was viewed as being authoritative, not only in spiritual matters, we all agree with that, but it also took it seriously in historical matters and even in scientific matters.
So right there in that segment, he actually reveals what I would say is very much at the heart of why there is so much misconception and skewed thinking when it comes to modern-day creationism, modern-day apologetics, just the mainstream Christian worldview, particularly in the West. And anytime you listen to practically any of these mainline biblical creationist ministries, if you let them talk long enough, they will all say the same thing. They have all bought into this idea that it was the Christian worldview which made modern science possible, and then they try and say that only in the last couple of centuries that science took a wrong turn and got into Darwinism and atheism. And so this is the historical perspective, which essentially they all have. And so the question is this really accurate? Or is this argument that they're making about natural philosophy really a true representation of what we find in the Bible? Or were all these figures that he mentions really being true to what Scripture says? Or is there a skewed understanding, whether knowingly or unknowingly, of the historical facts and of these arguments around the relationship between the Bible and science? The first guy he talks about is Francis Bacon, saying that he took the Bible very seriously, and I think, as many of you already know, Francis Bacon was in fact not at all a Christian. He may have taken the Bible very seriously, but the real question is, in what sense did he take the Bible seriously? To make a long story short, Francis Bacon was essentially the founder of Rosicrucianism. He was an esotericist. He was an occultist. Likewise, Isaac Newton, who's one of the favorite heroes of modern-day Christian science, yes, he did write a great deal about theology and did believe in intelligent design and a creator and a supreme being. At the same time, He was greatly influenced by Kabbalistic and Hermetic texts. And this is the issue which the vast majority of these mainstream creationist folks are completely deluded on, whereby they ignore the fact that this argument about the universe containing all these invisible laws which God imbued upon creation with the intention of us to study and seek them out and quantify it and essentially unravel all these mysteries, these embedded mysteries, as a way of getting to know him, as a way of seeking a relationship with him. This is not something you find in the Bible. This is not something we see any of the patriarchs doing, any of the prophets, any of the New Testament apostles, and so what enclosed cosmology in this whole flat earth debate that's busting open really reveals is that the contemporary church has this gross misconception about science being essentially a gift from God, a Christian gift to the world. And this is idolatry, because when you boil it down, what it really amounts to is a loose form of dominionism. So instead of just the revelation as given in the Word about who God is and what we can and can't know about His creation, it's buttressed by this idea of natural philosophy, which absolutely does come from the Greeks and from the mystery schools and from Egypt and Babylon. If you know anything about Hermeticism is all about the Hermetic principles, the Hermetic laws, the idea that the entire universe is governed by invisible forces which can eventually be understood and manipulated. You don't find anything in the scriptures about invisible laws and forces, and the idea that we should do experiments to figure out exactly how they work and how to quantify them and how to eventually reduce everything in God's creation into a formula. It's just not there. And so, like Jesus said, a little bit of yeast works through the whole dough. This is one thing that I see is really being at the core of so much of the blindness of people who are encapsulated with a worldview that they don't even realize, a lot of times don't even realize that they hold. This is what is at the core of so many people who assume that Western civilization is a gift from God, or that America is his chosen instrument, and so on. And so that they can't even see how much of an instrument of the kingdom of darkness it all is. This is at the root of that, because they have turned the country and the culture and this quote unquote legacy into an idol, into a source of intellectual pride, nationalistic pride in this legacy of Christian culture and science. And it's just baloney and completely unbiblical. Nowhere in the Bible do we find technology and scientific understanding portrayed as the means by which God is pouring out his grace upon the world. You just don't. So hopefully this serves as another example to show people how all these things fit together. It's not just about a ball versus flat. There's deep underlying philosophical and historical concepts that are completely upside down. And this quote-unquote Christian scientific revolution was really an ideological Trojan horse whereby false teaching has taken the church captive. But now God is freeing people from this blindness, and it's a beautiful thing.